Hans Mueller noticed something different about the snow quality that morning. 25 years of experience told him the avalanche risk was at critical levels, but no one took his warning seriously until the mountain collapsed. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise walking among us. The Alpine Ridge Resort perched on the Colorado mountainside, like a crystalline jewel against the snow-covered peaks, its luxury accommodations and world-class ski runs attracting wealthy vacationers from around the globe. At 9,800 feet elevation, the resort offered some of the most spectacular alpine skiing in North America, with challenging terrain that demanded both skill and respect for the mountain's unpredictable moods. The resort had been built in 1987 by Swiss investors who understood both luxury hospitality and mountain engineering. The main lodge stood as a testament to alpine architecture, with massive timber beams, soaring windows that framed the surrounding peaks, and stone fireplaces that could warm dozens of guests after long days on the slopes. 5 separate guest buildings housed luxury suites, each positioned to maximize privacy while maintaining quick access to the resort's extensive network of ski trails. Hans Mueller emerged from the ski patrol lodge at 6:30 a.m., his weathered face reading the mountain conditions with eyes trained by decades of experience in high-altitude environments. At 54, he moved with the efficient economy of someone who understood that every movement in thin air required careful consideration, though his current role as head ski instructor suggested nothing more dangerous than teaching parallel turns to nervous beginners. His morning routine had been the same for 12 years. Check the overnight snowfall measurements, review weather data from the National Weather Service, examine wind speed and direction readings from instruments positioned throughout the resort's terrain. Most importantly, conduct a visual assessment of snow conditions that would determine which runs were safe for the day's ski lessons. This particular morning, March 15th, Hans found himself studying data that created a familiar sense of unease. The overnight snowfall had been heavier than predicted, 9 to 22 inches of new snow, rather than the forecasted 12 to 15 inches. Wind readings showed sustained speeds of 35 miles per hour from the southwest, with gusts reaching 50 mph during the early morning hours. But it wasn't just the numbers that concerned Hans, it was the way the snow looked and felt as he moved through it during his pre-dawn assessment. The new snow had a density and texture that his 25 years of European alpine experience recognized as potentially dangerous when combined with existing snowpack conditions. Hans had begun his career in 1975 as a young mountain guide in Innsbruck, Austria. The Austrian Alps were renowned for producing some of the world's most skilled mountaineers and avalanche specialists, and Hans had learned from masters who understood snow science with an intimacy that came from generations of mountain experience. During his first decade in Austria, Hans had witnessed the devastating power of avalanches firsthand. The winter of 1984 had been particularly brutal, with a series of avalanches throughout the Alps that claimed over 100 lives and destroyed entire villages. Hans had participated in the rescue efforts, learning techniques for victim location, emergency medical treatment, and survival in extreme conditions that would define his professional specialization. By 1990, Hans had become one of Austria's youngest certified avalanche rescue coordinators, responsible for training emergency response teams and developing safety protocols for ski areas throughout the country. His expertise had been sought by mountain rescue organizations across Europe, and he'd participated in international conferences on avalanche science and rescue methodology. The alpine rescue community was small and closely knit. Hans knew personally many of the specialists who'd developed the techniques and equipment that made modern avalanche rescue possible. He'd worked with Swiss researchers who studied snow crystal formation, French guides who pioneered victim location methods, and Italian emergency responders who developed hypothermia treatment protocols. In 1995, Hans had been selected to lead the Austrian National Avalanche Rescue Training Program, a position that involved coordinating with government agencies, ski resort operators, and international rescue organizations. The work was deeply satisfying but psychologically demanding, as Hans carried responsibility for training the people who would save lives during some of the most dangerous emergencies in mountain environments. During his 25 years in European rescue work, Hans had personally participated in 347 avalanche rescue operations. He'd helped develop new victim location techniques, improved emergency medical protocols, and trained over 200 rescue specialists who went on to save thousands of lives throughout the Alps. But by 2000, Hans had begun to feel the psychological weight of a career spent responding to tragedies. The constant stress of life and death decisions, the emotional toll of unsuccessful rescues, and the physical demands of high-altitude emergency work had begun to affect his personal life and mental health. The turning point came during the winter of 2001, when Hans coordinated the rescue effort for a massive avalanche in the Austrian village of Galtür. The slide had buried 38 people, and despite heroic rescue efforts that continued for 6 days, 31 victims could not be saved. Hans had personally supervised the location and recovery of 23 bodies, an experience that forced him to confront the limitations of even the most skilled rescue operations. After the Galtur tragedy, Hans made the difficult decision to leave professional rescue work. He moved to the United States in 2002, seeking a way to remain connected to mountain environments while stepping away from the constant trauma of emergency response work. Hans chose Colorado because the mountain terrain reminded him of home, but the ski industry offered opportunities to use his mountain expertise in educational rather than emergency contexts. He obtained his American ski instructor certification and found work at various Colorado resorts, gradually moving toward positions that emphasized teaching rather than rescue. Alpine Ridge Resort had hired Hans in 2010, attracted by his obvious expertise and calm demeanor with nervous skiers. Resort management knew Hans had extensive European skiing background, but they'd never inquired deeply into the specifics of his previous work. Hans preferred it that way, content to let his colleagues assume he'd been a ski instructor or mountain guide in Austria, rather than one of Europe's most experienced avalanche rescue specialists. For 12 years, Hans had successfully maintained this carefully constructed anonymity. He taught skiing with patience and skill, focusing on helping guests develop confidence and safety awareness, rather than advanced technique. His students appreciated his calm presence and obvious mountain knowledge, never suspecting that their instructor possessed expertise that could coordinate large-scale emergency operations. Hans had found peace in this simpler approach to mountain work. Instead of responding to disasters, he was helping prevent them by teaching people to ski safely and respect mountain conditions. Instead of carrying responsibility for life and death decisions, he was sharing the joy and freedom that had originally drawn him to mountain environments. But this March morning, as Hans studied snow conditions that triggered every instinct developed during his European career, he faced the possibility that his quiet retirement from rescue work might be interrupted by exactly the kind of emergency he'd spent 12 years trying to avoid. To the resort guests who took lessons from him, Hans was simply Instructor Mueller, a patient educator with a slight Austrian accent who could transform terrified novices into confident intermediate skiers in just a few days. His teaching style emphasized safety awareness, proper technique, and developing an intuitive understanding of mountain conditions that would serve students long after their vacation ended. Hans's students often commented on his ability to read weather and snow conditions with remarkable accuracy. He seemed to know instinctively when conditions were becoming dangerous, when certain slopes should be avoided, and when the mountain was telling experienced observers to exercise extra caution. What they didn't understand was that Hans's weather predictions came from decades of studying how atmospheric conditions affected snow stability in alpine environments. His ability to assess slope safety came from years of investigating avalanche accidents and learning to identify the subtle indicators that preceded catastrophic snow failures. The resort staff knew Hans as a reliable employee who'd worked 12 seasons at Alpine Ridge, maintaining safety standards and never missing a day due to weather conditions that would ground other instructors. He was often consulted informally about snow conditions and weather forecasts, though always in his capacity as an experienced ski instructor rather than as someone with specialized avalanche training. Resort manager Patricia Coleman had worked with Hans for 8 years and considered him one of their most valuable instructors. His students consistently gave him excellent reviews, praising both his teaching ability and his obvious mountain expertise. Coleman knew Hans had extensive European skiing background, but she'd never felt the need to investigate the specifics of his previous work. Head of Ski Patrol Jake Morrison had developed considerable respect for Hans during their overlapping years at Alpine Ridge. Morrison was a certified avalanche specialist himself, having completed advanced training through the American Avalanche Association, and he recognized that Hans possessed mountain knowledge that went beyond normal instructor training. Hans has an intuitive understanding of snow conditions that you usually only see in people with extensive backcountry experience, Morrison had once told Coleman. I'm not sure exactly what he did in Austria, but he definitely understands mountain safety at a very sophisticated level. Morrison's assessment was more accurate than he realized. Hans did indeed possess mountain knowledge that went far beyond normal instructor training, though the full scope of his expertise remained hidden behind his carefully maintained persona as a ski instructor who happened to have good mountain sense. What none of them knew was that Hans Mueller had spent 25 years as a certified mountain rescue specialist in the Austrian Alps, coordinating avalanche rescue operations and training emergency response teams for some of the most dangerous mountain terrain in Europe. His colleagues at Alpine Ridge saw the man who taught tourists to ski. They had no idea they were working alongside someone who'd personally participated in over 300 avalanche rescues during his European career. This particular March morning, Hans was conducting his routine assessment of snow conditions and avalanche risk when he detected something that made him deeply uneasy. The combination of recent snowfall, wind patterns, and temperature fluctuations created exactly the kind of layered snow structure that experienced avalanche specialists learned to fear. The weather data told only part of the story. Overnight temperatures had dropped to -15 ff, creating a hard crust on the previous day's snow surface. The new snowfall had then accumulated on top of this crust, creating what avalanche specialists called a slab formation, a cohesive layer of snow that could fail catastrophically if the underlying support structure became unstable. Hans studied the surrounding peaks with eyes trained to read the subtle signs of unstable snow formations. The recent storm had deposited 18 inches of new snow on top of an existing layer that showed signs of weak bonding. More concerning, the wind had created loading patterns on the slopes above the resort that concentrated snow weight in potentially dangerous configurations. Wind loading was one of the most dangerous factors in avalanche formation. When strong winds moved snow from windward to leeward slopes, they could create accumulations that were far deeper and heavier than natural snowfall would produce. These wind-loaded areas often became trigger points for avalanches that could propagate across much larger areas. Hans could see evidence of significant wind loading on the slopes above Alpine Ridge Resort. Snow plumes were visible on the ridgelines, indicating that wind had been transporting large quantities of snow throughout the night. The accumulation patterns suggested that several thousand tons of additional snow had been deposited on slopes that were already carrying near maximum loads from the winter's previous storms. Moving to the resort's avalanche monitoring station, Hans checked the latest snowpack stability data and weather forecasts. Alpine Ridge maintained sophisticated monitoring equipment that measured snow depth, density, temperature gradients, and other factors that influenced avalanche risk. What he saw confirmed his visual assessment and triggered every instinct developed during 25 years of avalanche safety work. The snowpack showed classic indicators of high avalanche risk: temperature gradients that weakened internal snow layers, wind loading that created unstable accumulations, and new snow deposits that exceeded the underlying structure's ability to provide stable support. The snowpack profile data was particularly concerning. Temperature measurements from various depths showed a classic bridging pattern where warmer snow layers were supporting colder, more brittle layers above. This type of structure could fail suddenly when subjected to additional weight or vibration. Most dangerous of all, the weather forecast predicted rising temperatures and strong winds throughout the day. Rising temperatures would further weaken the bridging layers, while continued wind loading would add even more weight to already unstable accumulations. Hans had seen these exact conditions before during some of the most devastating avalanche disasters of his European career. The combination of factors piners, heavy new snow, wind loading, temperature gradients, and forecast warming created what avalanche specialists called a perfect storm of conditions that could produce large, fast-moving avalanches with little warning. Hans made a decision that would force him to choose between maintaining his quiet anonymity and taking action based on knowledge that others at the resort didn't possess. At 7:15 a.m., he approached resort manager Patricia Coleman with a recommendation that would seem disproportionate to his official role as a ski instructor. Coleman was in her office reviewing the day's operational plans when Hans knocked on her door. She looked up from reports showing guest reservations, lift operations schedules, and weather forecasts with the calm efficiency of someone who'd managed mountain resort operations for over a decade. "Good morning, Hans," Coleman said. "How are conditions looking for today's lessons?" "Miss Coleman," Hans said quietly, "I believe we should consider closing the upper mountain areas today due to avalanche conditions." Coleman looked up from her morning operational reports with surprise. In 12 years of working with Hans, he'd never made recommendations about resort-wide safety policies. His role as head ski instructor involved teaching guests and maintaining safety standards for lessons, but operational decisions about lift closures and slope access were made by ski patrol and resort management. "Hans, what makes you think we have avalanche concerns?" "Our ski patrol conducted standard assessments and found normal march conditions." Hans studied the woman who'd employed him for over a decade, considering how much of his background to reveal. For 12 years, he'd successfully avoided discussions about his previous work in Austria, preferring to let his colleagues assume he'd been a ski instructor or mountain guide rather than someone with specialized emergency response training. "I have experience reading avalanche conditions from my previous work in Austria. The current snowpack structure and weather patterns indicate significant instability risk." Coleman was intrigued but skeptical. Hans had always demonstrated excellent mountain knowledge, but avalanche assessment was a highly specialized field that required extensive training and certification. What kind of experience in Austria? Hans felt the careful anonymity he'd maintained for 12 years beginning to crack. "Mountain rescue operations. I specialized in avalanche safety and emergency response for 25 years before I came to work here." The revelation that her ski instructor claimed extensive avalanche expertise seemed inconsistent with his role teaching basic skiing techniques to resort guests. Coleman knew Hans was knowledgeable about mountain conditions, but the scope of expertise he was claiming suggested professional training that went far beyond normal instructor qualifications. Hans, I appreciate your concern, but we have certified ski patrol personnel who specialize in avalanche assessment. Jake Morrison completed advanced training through the American Avalanche Association. They haven't indicated any unusual risk levels. Hans looked through Coleman's office window at the slopes where early skiers were already beginning to descend runs that his experience told him were potentially lethal. He could see ski patrol personnel conducting their morning safety checks, following standard protocols that were designed for normal resort conditions. The problem was that the conditions Hans was reading weren't normal. They were the kind of extreme avalanche risk that occurred only a few times each decade, when multiple dangerous factors combined to create catastrophic potential. Miss Coleman, the ski patrol's assessment protocols are designed for normal resort conditions. What I'm seeing indicates conditions that exceed standard safety margins. Coleman had operational pressures that made closing profitable ski terrain difficult to justify based on the concerns of a ski instructor, regardless of his claimed background. Alpine Ridge Resort generated most of its revenue from lift ticket sales and ski lesson bookings. Closing the upper mountain on what appeared to be a beautiful skiing day would cost the resort tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue. Hans, unless our certified patrol indicates elevated risk, we need to maintain normal operations. I appreciate your input, but we'll follow standard protocols. Hans understood Coleman's position, but his 25 years of avalanche experience told him that standard protocols weren't adequate for the conditions they were facing. The European rescue community had developed more sophisticated risk assessment methods after decades of learning from avalanche disasters. Mr. Coleman, I understand the operational concerns, but I believe the risk level justifies extraordinary precautions. Hans, I'm sure you have valuable mountain experience, but we can't make operational decisions based on informal assessments. We need to follow established safety protocols and rely on our certified personnel. Hans realized that his unofficial recommendation wouldn't be sufficient to change resort operations. Without revealing the full scope of his background, he couldn't provide the kind of authoritative assessment that would justify closing ski terrain. Hans returned to his teaching duties, knowing he'd done what he could within his official capacity, but his 25 years of avalanche experience told him that the mountain was preparing to demonstrate why experience and official protocols sometimes led to different conclusions. Lifts opened on schedule, ski patrol completed their standard safety checks, and guests began arriving for their planned day of skiing. Hans conducted his first lesson of the day with a group of intermediate skiers, but his attention remained focused on the surrounding peaks and the developing weather conditions. At 9 a.m., Hans was working with 6 students on parallel turn technique when he noticed the first subtle changes in wind patterns that indicated the weather was beginning to match the dangerous forecasts he'd reviewed earlier. The wind had shifted from southwest to northwest and was beginning to increase in velocity. This change was significant because it would now be loading snow onto different slopes, including some of the steeper terrain directly above the resort's main facilities. Hans watched snow plumes beginning to form on the ridgelines above Alpine Ridge, indicating that wind speeds were approaching the threshold where large-scale snow transport would begin. The combination of rising temperatures and increasing wind was creating exactly the conditions that his European experience had taught him to fear. At 10:15 a.m., Hans completed his first lesson and was preparing for his second group when he encountered Jake Morrison, the head of ski patrol, near the base lodge. "Morning, Hans," Morrison said. "How are your students handling the powder conditions?" "The skiing is excellent," Hans replied, "but I'm concerned about wind loading on the upper slopes. Have you been monitoring the accumulation patterns?" Morrison looked at Hans with the kind of attention that one mountain professional gives another when discussing safety concerns. "We did our standard morning assessment. Didn't see anything that concerned us." "Why? What are you seeing?" Hans pointed toward the peaks above the resort, where snow plumes were now clearly visible. "Wind loading on the northwest faces, combined with last night's temperature gradient and this morning's warming trend, I think we might be approaching critical stability thresholds." Morrison followed Hans's gaze and studied the snow transport patterns that were becoming more pronounced as the wind continued to increase. "Those are significant plumes. We should probably do an afternoon reassessment if this continues. Jake, I think we should consider closing some of the upper terrain now, before conditions deteriorate further." Morrison looked at Hans with surprise. While Hans had always demonstrated good mountain sense, he'd never before made specific recommendations about slope closures or operational decisions. "Hans, what's your background with avalanche assessment? You seem to understand stability factors at a pretty sophisticated level." Hans faced the same decision he'd encountered earlier with Coleman, how much of his background to reveal. "I had extensive mountain rescue training in Austria. Avalanche safety was a significant part of that work." "Mountain rescue? What kind of mountain rescue?" "Avalanche rescue operations. I worked with emergency response teams for about 25 years. Morrison stared at Hans with growing amazement. "You worked avalanche rescue for 25 years. Why didn't you ever mention that background?" "Because I came here to teach skiing, not to work rescue operations. I've been very happy with instruction work. But Hans, if you have that level of avalanche expertise, your input on safety assessments would be invaluable. We should definitely discuss the conditions you're concerned about. Hans felt relieved that at least one person at the resort was taking his concerns seriously. Jake, I believe we're looking at extreme risk conditions that could produce large, fast-moving avalanches with very little warning. Morrison's expression became serious. Can you show me specifically what you're seeing? Hans led Morrison to a vantage point where they could observe the slopes above the resort. For the next 20 minutes, Hans provided a detailed analysis of the avalanche risk factors that his European training had taught him to recognize. The snowpack structure shows classic bridging patterns that can fail catastrophically, Hans explained, pointing to areas where different snow layers were visible in wind-scoured sections. Combined with continued wind loading and rising temperatures, we're approaching conditions that could produce avalanches in the 500,000 to 1,000 cubic meter range. Morrison was taking notes as Hans spoke, recognizing that he was receiving a level of avalanche analysis that exceeded his own training. Hans, those are massive slide predictions. What would the run-out zones look like for avalanches of that size? Hans studied the terrain below the unstable slopes, calculating the likely paths and distances that major avalanches would travel. His analysis was based on physics principles and terrain features that determined how avalanches behaved in specific mountain environments. Depending on the exact failure location, run-out zones could extend to the resort's main facilities. We could be looking at debris depths of 10 to 15 feet in some areas. The implications of Hans's analysis were staggering. If his assessment was correct, Alpine Ridge Resort was sitting directly in the path of potential avalanches that could bury buildings and cause massive casualties. Morrison made a decision that demonstrated the respect he'd developed for Hans's mountain expertise. Hans, I think we need to bring this to Coleman immediately. If there's any chance you're right about these risk levels, we need to take action. At 10:45 a.m., Hans found himself back in Coleman's office, this time accompanied by Morrison and providing a detailed technical assessment of avalanche risk that drew on his 25 years of European rescue experience. Patricia, Morrison said, Hans has been providing me with an avalanche risk analysis that goes far beyond anything in our standard protocols. I think we need to hear what he has to say. Coleman looked between her head of ski patrol and her ski instructor, trying to understand why an operational discussion was needed about conditions that had been assessed as normal just hours earlier. Jake, what kind of analysis? We completed our standard morning evaluation. Patricia, Hans has extensive avalanche rescue background from Austria. His risk assessment suggests we might be facing extreme conditions that our standard protocols aren't designed to handle. Coleman turned to Hans with new attention. Hans, Jake says you have avalanche rescue experience. Can you explain specifically what you're seeing? For the first time in 12 years, Hans provided a complete professional assessment based on his European training and experience. He explained snowpack analysis, wind loading calculations, temperature gradient effects, and the physics of large avalanche formation. Ms. Coleman, the combination of factors we're observing today creates what avalanche specialists call a perfect storm scenario. Multiple risk elements are combining to create extreme instability that could produce avalanches significantly larger and more dangerous than anything in this resort's recent history. Coleman was beginning to understand that Hans possessed expertise that went far beyond normal ski instructor training. Hans, when you say avalanche rescue experience, what exactly do you mean? I was a certified avalanche rescue coordinator in Austria for 25 years. I coordinated emergency response operations, trained rescue teams, and participated in over 300 avalanche rescue missions. The scope of Hans's hidden expertise was becoming clear. Coleman was learning that her ski instructor was actually one of the most qualified avalanche specialists available anywhere in Colorado. Hans, if you have that level of expertise, why are you working as a ski instructor? Because after 25 years of dealing with avalanche emergencies, I wanted work that involved preventing accidents rather than responding to them. Coleman made a decision that would either save lives or cost the resort significant revenue. Hans, what do you recommend? I recommend immediate closure of all upper mountain terrain and evacuation of the main lodge to buildings that are outside the calculated run-out zones. The recommendation was far more dramatic than anything Coleman had expected. Hans, that would essentially shut down the resort for the day. Are you certain about the risk assessment? Miss Coleman, I'm certain that the risk factors exceed any safety margins that would be considered acceptable in European avalanche management protocols. Morrison supported Hans's recommendation. Patricia, given Hans's background, I think we should seriously consider his assessment. Coleman faced a decision that would cost the resort tens of thousands of dollars if Hans was wrong, but could save dozens of lives if he was right. At 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Hans was conducting an intermediate lesson on the mid-mountain slopes when he felt something that made him immediately stop the class. A subtle vibration through his skis, barely perceptible but unmistakably familiar to someone who'd spent decades learning to read mountain stability through the soles of his feet. the kind of deep, low-frequency movement that indicated large-scale snow displacement. Hans had felt this exact sensation dozens of times during his European career, always in the moments before major avalanche events. It was the mountain's final warning that catastrophic snow failure was imminent. "Everyone stop skiing immediately," Hans commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made his students freeze in place. Hans scanned the peaks above the resort, his trained eye searching for the visual confirmation of what his experience had detected through ground vibration. His 6 students, 2 couples from Denver and a father-son pair from Chicago, looked at him with confusion and growing concern. "Mr. Mueller, what's wrong?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old marketing executive who'd been making excellent progress with her parallel turns. "Please remain exactly where you are," Hans replied, his eyes continuing to scan the mountain faces above them. "Do not make any sudden movements." What he saw confirmed his worst fears. High on the mountain face above Alpine Ridge Resort, a massive snow formation was beginning the catastrophic failure that Hans had predicted hours earlier. A crack line appeared across the slope, extending for hundreds of yards as the entire snow load prepared to release. The crack was visible even from their position nearly a mile away, a dark line that seemed to grow larger by the second as the snowpack began to separate along the failure plane that Hans's analysis had identified. "Get behind those trees immediately," Hans shouted to his students, pointing toward a cluster of large pines that would provide some protection from what was coming. His students began moving with the urgency that Hans's tone conveyed, though they still didn't understand the magnitude of the danger that was developing above them. The avalanche began as a whisper of moving snow, then exploded into a roaring wall of white destruction that swept down the mountain face toward the resort below. Hans watched in horror as millions of tons of snow accelerated toward buildings that housed 80 guests and staff members who had no idea what was about to hit them. The sound began as a distant rumble, like thunder, that continued far longer than any natural storm. But as the avalanche gained momentum and mass, the sound became a roar that seemed to shake the entire mountain. Hans's students stood transfixed by the sight of the enormous white cloud that was racing down the mountain toward them. The avalanche was moving faster than any of them could have imagined possible, traveling at speeds that would reach nearly 100 miles per hour as it swept across the landscape. "Stay behind the trees," Hans ordered. "Do not move until I tell you it's safe." The avalanche was following exactly the path that Hans's analysis had predicted. The main mass was directed toward the resort's lower buildings, but debris and air blast effects would extend far beyond the primary impact zone. As they watched from their protected position, the wave of snow struck Alpine Ridge Resort with the force of a natural disaster, engulfing the main lodge and several outlying buildings in a cascade of white that transformed the luxury facility into a partially buried survival scenario. The main lodge, which had stood majestically against the mountain backdrop just minutes earlier, disappeared beneath a wall of snow that was over 20 feet deep in some areas. 2 of the guest buildings were completely buried, while 3 others were partially damaged by the enormous pressures and debris created by the avalanche. Hans's students watched in stunned silence as the resort where they'd been staying was transformed into a disaster zone. The skiing vacation that had begun with perfect powder conditions had become a survival situation that would test every skill Hans had developed during his 25 years of European rescue work. When the roar of the avalanche finally subsided, an eerie silence settled over the mountain. The only sounds were the settling of snow debris and the distant calls of people who had survived the initial impact but were now trapped in partially buried buildings. Hans's 25 years of avalanche rescue experience immediately took over. While others stood frozen by the magnitude of the disaster, Hans was already moving toward the buried buildings, his mind automatically shifting into the systematic crisis management mode that had saved hundreds of lives during his European career. "Everyone follow me," Hans announced to his students, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd managed similar disasters before. "We're going to help with rescue operations." "Mr. Mueller, shouldn't we wait for professional rescue teams?" asked David Chen, the father in the father-son pair from Chicago. "Professional rescue teams will take hours to reach us through these snow conditions," Hans replied as he began moving quickly toward the buried resort buildings. "People who are trapped have minutes to hours for survival, depending on their situation." Hans reached the avalanche debris field and immediately began the systematic assessment that was the first step in any major rescue operation. He needed to determine how many people were trapped, where they were most likely to be located, and what resources were available for rescue efforts. The main lodge was buried under approximately 15 feet of avalanche debris. The snow was densely packed from the enormous pressures of the slide, making it extremely difficult to dig through, but Hans could see that the building's structure had remained largely intact. More critically, Hans could hear voices calling from inside the buried building, indicating that there were survivors who needed immediate assistance. Resort manager Patricia Coleman, who'd been in the main lodge when the avalanche hit, emerged from a partially collapsed entrance with several other staff members. Her earlier skepticism about Hans's warnings was now replaced by desperate recognition that the ski instructor who'd predicted this disaster might be their best hope for survival. Coleman was shaken but uninjured, though her clothes were torn and she was covered with snow and debris from the building's partial collapse. Behind her came Jake Morrison, the head of ski patrol, and 3 other staff members who had been in the lodge when the avalanche struck. "Hans, what do we do?" Coleman asked, her voice tight with controlled panic. Hans was already assessing the disaster scene with eyes trained by decades of avalanche rescue operations. The main lodge was partially buried, but structurally intact. Several guest cabins were completely covered. Most critically, the avalanche had severed all external communications and blocked access roads that would normally allow professional rescue teams to reach the resort. The scope of the disaster was becoming clear. Approximately 80 people had been at the resort when the avalanche struck. Hans could account for about 20 people who had been outside the impact zone or had escaped from buildings before they were completely buried. That meant approximately 60 people were still trapped in various locations throughout the debris field. "First priority is locating and stabilizing any trapped persons," Hans announced. "Second priority is establishing shelter and preventing hypothermia. Third priority is organizing for extended survival until external rescue can reach us." Coleman stared at the ski instructor who was suddenly demonstrating expert knowledge of disaster management protocols. "Hans, how do you know about avalanche rescue procedures?" "Because I ran avalanche rescue operations in Austria for 25 years. I'm certified in mountain rescue, emergency medicine, and survival operations." The scope of Hans's hidden expertise was beginning to dawn on everyone present. The quiet ski instructor who'd been teaching parallel turns 12 hours earlier was actually one of the most qualified avalanche rescue specialists they could have hoped for in their current situation. Morrison, despite his own certification in avalanche safety, recognized that Hans possessed expertise that exceeded his training. "Hans, what do you need from us?" Hans was already organizing the survival operation with the methodical efficiency that had made him one of Europe's most respected avalanche rescue coordinators. "I need teams for victim location, medical triage, and shelter construction. We have approximately 6 hours of daylight to locate buried victims and establish sustainable survival conditions." Hans began implementing the systematic approach to avalanche rescue that he'd developed during his European career. The first step was establishing incident command and organizing available personnel into specialized teams. "Jake, I need you to coordinate victim location efforts. Take anyone with mountain experience and begin systematic probing in the high-probability areas around the buried buildings. Patricia, I need you to establish a medical triage area and coordinate care for injured victims as we locate them. Also, inventory all available food, water, and medical supplies. Everyone else, we need to begin construction of emergency shelters and warming areas for victims who may be suffering from hypothermia." What followed was a demonstration of avalanche rescue expertise that none of the Alpine Ridge staff had ever witnessed. Hans's approach was systematic, prioritized, and devastatingly effective at organizing chaos into coordinated survival efforts. Hans had learned during his European career that successful avalanche rescue depended on understanding both the physics of snow burial and the physiology of human survival in extreme conditions. Victims buried in avalanche debris faced multiple threats: crushing injuries from the initial impact, suffocation from compressed snow around their airways, and hypothermia from prolonged exposure to cold conditions. Avalanche burial survival time is measured in minutes for complete burial, hours for partial burial, Hans explained as he organized search teams. "We locate victims by systematic probing in high-probability areas based on avalanche flow patterns." Hans's knowledge of avalanche dynamics allowed him to predict where victims were most likely to be found based on the snow's behavior during the slide. Buildings and vehicles created eddy currents in avalanche flow that could either protect people or create areas where victims were more likely to be deposited. The systematic probing technique that Hans directed involved inserting long poles into the avalanche debris at regular intervals, feeling for the resistance patterns that indicated buried objects or people. It was slow, methodical work that required patience and systematic coverage of large areas. Michael and Jennifer worked this grid pattern around the north side of the lodge. Hans directed his former ski students who had become crucial members of the rescue team. "Probe every 2 feet in both directions. When you feel something that might be a person, call me immediately." Hans established teams to search each of the buried buildings and areas where people had been known to be present when the avalanche struck. The main lodge required the largest search effort, as it had housed the greatest number of people at the time of the slide. Within the first hour of the rescue operation, Hans's teams had located 6 buried victims. 3 were found in air pockets within the partially collapsed lodge and were extracted with minor injuries. 2 others were found buried under several feet of snow, but were breathing and conscious when reached. The 6th victim, an elderly guest named Robert Patterson, was found buried under 8 feet of snow and was unconscious when the rescue team reached him. Hans immediately began the advanced life support procedures he'd learned during his European training. "Patricia, I need the medical supplies immediately," Hans called as he began assessing Patterson's condition, hypothermia protocol, and possible spinal injuries. Hans's medical training from his rescue career included advanced wilderness emergency medicine that was specifically designed for avalanche victims. He began the careful warming and stabilization procedures that could mean the difference between life and death for victims suffering from severe hypothermia. "Robert's core temperature is probably around 85 degrees, Hans explained as he worked. We need to rewarm him gradually while protecting his airway and circulation.